Okay, so this is going to be the topic group 3, the vectors theme talk. So Marcel's going to kick us off in a moment with a sort of online remote talk, just kind of giving a bit of an overview when that's all ready. Then I'm going to talk for a little bit, just kind of giving sort of just a bit of an overview of some of the actual bits of research we've done and some information about those. And then Stephen's going to be talking about some optimization work and just sort of the continuation of that. And then finally, Ian is going to talk about some of their work up there. So when we're ready, I guess. Oh yeah, Marcel.
Hi, can you see and hear me?
Yep, that's great.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sam. I would say it was nice to see everybody, but I can't actually see you. So it's nice to hear you and hear some of the conversations that have gone before. My name is Marcel McManus. I'm currently in Bath, so I'm very sorry not to be with you in Aston. And as Sam said, I'm just going to give a really brief overview of what we've been doing and also maybe to address that name, the vectors name, which I know has been causing problems with people as well. So if I can share my slides, I can't do that myself. Brilliant, thank you very much. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of some of the things that we've been doing in the Supergen Vectors theme and just to discuss some of the highlights with vectors at its centre. And then pass over, as Sam says, to him and to Stephen and to Ian to talk about some of the detailed research that's been going on in this area. So because the names come up already, I just thought I'd touch on that. And really, vectors has been quite difficult for some people, but really it's just basically what we can turn the biomass and into. So it's whether it's aviation fuel, whether it's road transport fuel, whether it's gas, whether it's electricity, whether it's platform chemicals, etc. And for all of these things, we need to think of it in the wider system. So of course, we've been working with the systems topic group very, very closely, as well as the other topic groups to get some of the information about how they're progressing some of the specific case studies that's been going on. And with all of this, we're looking at sort of climate change and optimization for climate change, really thinking about how these systems work together. And Stephen's going to be talking a little bit about that in a moment when he talks about some of the value chain work that he's been doing. And climate change, of course, is one of the drivers, but there are other things that we've been thinking about. Obviously, the other topic groups also thinking about resources. And as I said, we need to make sure that we're able to keep the lights on, keep the mobility going, keep the place heated, and just worked out where biomass and biosystems fit in best within all of this. So within this, we've been looking at lots of different things, and I thought I'd just give you a little taste of some of the work that we've been doing. So first up, I wanted to just touch on the fuel standard summary that we did, which was published in September 2020. Feels like a very long time ago now. And this was really looking to say, well, if we're going to have all of these fuels, what are the major standards? So that we have a go-to document that's it's up on the website. And people can go to and say, okay, if we're going to produce fuels in this area, what standards do we need to meet? What specifications do we need to meet? And just to make sure everything's all in one place. And this is quite a useful document for people because you can just go and see, right, well, if we need to, if we're going to be working with hydrogen, what do we need to do and how do we need to produce it and what standards do we need to meet for that? So it's a one-stop shop almost of all the different standards with lots and lots of links. So it's a nice document. We're also thinking as well, I mentioned just greenhouse gases. So we've also been thinking about timing and how that matters as well. So we all know that climate change is a particular issue which has got, we've got lots of targets leading up to 2050 and beyond. But what we do in the next few years is particularly critical. And often when we look at climate change, we look at it over a short period, a long period, such as 20 or 50 or 100 years, most commonly 100 years. But actually some of these bioenergy systems can either improve, greenhouse gas issues, or at times, if not appropriately managed, contribute more towards them over a shorter period of time. And this is where our work really comes in, because we can highlight where these impacts are happening and really try and reduce them, so you make these bioenergy systems as impact-free as possible. So we've produced some work on this, looking at the temporal aspects of climate change effects due to bioenergy. And you can see again, that's a cross-topic project here. And it's looking at how we can link different biomass feedstocks and how we use them in different areas. So if we use them for heating, if we use them in different for different vectors, the different impacts that can have, depending on where the methane is emitted compared with carbon dioxide. And you can see here, you can get cyclical impacts over different varying times. So with this information, then you can make the best policy choices and the best industry choices as well. So that gives us a little overview of some of that work that we've been doing too. We've also been looking at gasification and barriers to some of the projects that have been going ahead or not going ahead, contributing to the IEA tasks, working with the French Environment Agency and the low carbon vehicle fuels of people on them, footprint of hydrogen use in vehicles, and really looking at why some projects have been successful and trying to learn why some of these vectors are sort of taking off, or some of these fuels, some of these projects have been taking off, and why some have not been taking off, and trying to learn lessons from that and working on that within the wider sort of industrial perspective as well. So that then gives us some really good key learning for what we need to be doing as we take some of these more early stage systems forward in their development. I said I was only going to talk really, really quickly, which is absolutely true, because number one, I'm not with you, and it's far more interesting to listen to the people who are on the ground and doing the research. But vectors don't work independently. We need to be thinking about how we best use this biomass, as everyone's probably been already talking today, and we know that how they integrate is critical. And so how we produce hydrogen, how that integrates with the existing electricity system, the existing heating system, and the existing platform chemicals, the existing transport and mobility fuels system, how that all integrates is absolutely critical to the success of any particular pathway. And this is what we really need to be thinking about when we're thinking about vectors. And that's why I want to pass over to what Sam and Stephen and Ian have been doing to really talk about some of this individual vector analysis in terms of their impact and also how they all fit together. So that's it from me. I will be around for this session if anyone's got any questions, but I just want to say thank you very much to Stephen and to Sam and to Ian for their presentations, and I will pass you over to Sam next.
Good. Thanks, Marcel. Does anyone want to ask any quick questions before we kind of move on with some other stuff? Any other points of clarification or anything? Okay, cool. So, here we go. Brilliant. So the next sort of few minutes, what I'm going to do, some of the points I'll kind of be mentioning are similar to the bits which Marcel was mentioning there, but essentially just running through some of the research which we've done over the last couple of years, giving a couple of kind of key points about it. Really is to let you know about what we've been doing, so if you're interested, you can kind of look it up or ask us for a bit more information. Okay, so the first thing which we actually did was looking at, so we know energy vectors, different forms of bioenergy are used, and quite often we can get good statistics on the actual format of them, be it sort of fuels or gaseous fuels and so on. But actually we wanted to look at what are the energy services which drive the demand for those fuels, and then what are also the what are the actual end products and the things which drive the need for those energy services. So we used a technique called input-output analysis. Sorry. To look at actually how different uses and different activity across the economy drives the use of bioenergy. More recently, we've been able to kind of carry that forward a bit, and there we've been looking at how different models look at industrial use of bioenergy, both now and how they're modelling its progression into the future. So that wasn't particularly our work doing the modelling, more where we're seeing our input. It has been in sort of looking at the parameters, looking at the assumptions they're using, and trying to ensure that actually decisions which are made based on this modelling are robust as possible. Marcel mentioned this work on gasification. Really the motivation here is that gasification is seen as a very useful, it's a very versatile and very valuable technology in terms of bioenergy. But certainly at the point when we were doing this research, it hadn't really seen the level of commercial success and the level of adoption which we would sort of hoped for and expected. So we were looking at why that was, and so it involved a lot of conversations with people and really trying to sort of tease out some of the reasons. And there were about a dozen or so reasons actually in total that we kind of came up with, various different themes. But one of the things which was I thought was kind of interesting, was kind of fun here, is actually we could group them together, and you could imagine there's sort of aspects of finance, there's some technical barriers where actually academic research might play a bit of a role. Also quite a lot of non-technical commercial barriers. But actually in terms of looking at how they interact, was really a kind of a key part of this, saying that actually often it's that when there's challenges relating to one of these aspects, that can have a knock-on effect to the others, and the whole thing sort of falls apart. And I guess the positive spin on that, therefore, is that actually if we can have some successful demonstrators, and actually in the last kind of couple of years we're starting to see that happening, actually you can see a lot more confidence being developed in these technologies, and actually in being able to do them at a commercial scale. Again, another one which we mentioned here was the dynamics of the climate change impacts associated with bioenergy. And really the motivation here, or one of the key motivations, is that bioenergy, it's both something which varies in its emissions over time. It's not like a sort of a single point of emissions. There's emissions and absorptions over time. But also the greenhouse gases involved. So you've got CO2, but you've also got quite a lot of methane and potentially nitrous oxide. And they have different climate change impacts which vary over time. And so it's that kind of configuration of the two which means that a single metric, often the intuition that you take from it isn't necessarily correct. So we wanted to explore that a bit. We produced a simple software tool that people can use to look at how impacts might change over time, and how the sort of impacts associated with their system, whether or not actually a simple metric is appropriate to use. There was this fuel standards report, which again, Marcel mentioned. Rowan did a lot of good work on this, really providing a single point for people to look at actually what standards are applicable to the work they're doing and what kinds of considerations they might need to be making. Another recent graduate, Brendan, did some work with a local anaerobic digestion. It's actually a food waste operator near Bath. And Thomas Minter, the guy running it there, he's really keen to look at both what he's doing and how it could be improved. Actually, what are the points which really make a difference in terms of the greenhouse gas benefits associated with the plant. And so this was exciting from our point of view because it's a real operator, and we could actually look at, get our hands on some real data. A couple of points which I thought were really interesting here. So firstly, actually looking at the plant and looking at the benefit which it achieves, and how kind of a key point from Thomas's point of view is actually reducing fugitive methane emissions are really crucial to achieving a good benefit. But also they generate electricity at the moment, and we were looking at really the importance of selecting different vectors, and how hypothetically if we were to swap to biomethane production, the actual overall greenhouse benefit is much increased. So that's the kind of the middle thing there. And then again, in terms of just thinking about how different vectors affect the overall benefit, that has knock-on effects. Actually, Chris alluded to this morning, where you're needing to split out the CO2 from the methane in the biogas. So there's actually potential synergies to create further benefits. Another student, Gwen, did some work looking at sustainable aviation fuels. And again, this was kind of like a large, really quite large review, looking at different routes, different feedstocks, and the sort of variation in the kind of greenhouse gas intensity that we would be looking at with each of those. So that was kind of interesting. We took it on a bit further. So we were interested in, well, actually how much of that, and so this is the graph on the right here, how much of the impact is associated with not actually the process itself, but various things which are outside of the control of the operator. So where they're using, say, electricity or hydrogen from other sources, or where there are kind of benefits from selling other products which are kind of associated with the aviation fuel. And actually, it looked like a lot of the impact, and a lot of variation between different studies actually relates to impacts which are occurring outside of the system that they have a lot of control over. So we took this forward. This is a little bit more recent. Again, looking at a kind of a systematic review of different LCA studies relating to relating to the greenhouse gas intensity of sustainable aviation fuel. And really, what are the different components that make up that? And I guess here, optimistically, we were hoping that we'd be able to say, well, there's these different parts. So there's the feedstock itself, and we understand that that's important. There's the various inputs, hydrogen or electricity and so on. We understand those, but we can also minimize those. And then we have these various parts. Well, actually, surely each of those can be individually minimized. So perhaps these results should start to converge. And we were kind of having ideas about how this would be a really nice sort of overview. As it is, there's actually quite a lot of complexity in these supply chains. Looking in a bit more detail, it is quite complex. So there are these sort of overarching themes, which I'll touch on in a moment. But here, some of the actual engineering technicalities really bear quite a large effect. We've done a bit of work on looking at the greenhouse gas intensity of hydrogen produced from biomass. And there's a couple of points to note here. So this was looking at, again, a bunch of different studies, putting them on a sort of common basis and common boundaries, and looking and just comparing them, really. So the first observation, which we sort of thought was important here and is interesting, is that actually we need to be thinking much more in terms of the feedstock efficiency. So rather than because basically the amount of carbon dioxide you're putting out of the atmosphere is limited by the amount of feedstock you're using, kind of just in terms of the physical flows. And so it's tempting to imagine a low efficiency system. Actually, it pulls more CO2 out of the atmosphere, or there's more potential to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere for a given system. But actually, it's probably better to think in terms of you pulling out the same amount of CO2, but just producing less of whatever the end vector is that we're after. So trying to rethink how we actually picture these systems. Another observation which we thought was really interesting from this was just seeing how much difference there is in terms of the different systems, really depending upon engineering choices and ways in which different criteria have pushed or encouraged the developers to develop them and to configure their systems differently. So that was another thing. While we were looking at so basically biomass to hydrogen systems here, it was also worth comparing it to bioelectricity with CCS. You can see there's a little bit of comparison with the yellow data points on the right, and I guess the main point here is that they're actually fairly comparable in terms of their overall potential, but certainly biohydrogen with CCS is a good option to be thinking about. So I mentioned that we were trying to think about some common themes across these, and this is something which we'd like to develop a little bit more in this next kind of month or so. In a sense, it's tempting to simplify things and to kind of look at these as sort of things which are always true, but inevitably it's a bit more complicated. But there are some commonalities. So firstly, the upstream feedstock emissions clearly are important. Secondly, there's this issue around feedstock use efficiency, which seems to come up kind of time and time again in some of these studies. Third point is around the sort of ancillary emissions, so where systems are using other services or other product inputs. A lot of the times in the studies we've looked at, there seems to be a tendency for the developers to be trying to minimize these and to, which is good, of course, but to do it in ways which don't necessarily minimize the overall system-wide impacts and don't necessarily maximize the benefits overall. And the other 2 points really here, carbon capture rates across all flows, is again just emphasizing that where we see carbon dioxide emissions, actually capturing them across biogenic flows and non-biogenic flows is really important. There's no reason to not capture biogenic CO2 flows if it's possible on the same basis that you would do for fossil-based ones. The motivation to do that needs to be incentivized in the same way, really. And the final one is actually this importance, again, of thinking about what's actually being displaced. What is the vector which this bioenergy system is doing? And that needs a bit of thought sometimes. So this is kind of just the final little example. So again, we keep coming back to this example of electricity generation or hydrogen production, because both of them are presented as large potential uses relating to CCS. And sort of greenhouse gas removals. And so, as we saw just a couple of slides ago, they're quite comparable in terms of their CO2 removal potential. Actually, in terms of if you're just producing systems on their own, they're comparable in terms of their cost. But we were wondering, well, what would happen if we were to say, okay, actually we want electricity. So we've got the option to produce hydrogen or to produce electricity directly. With the hydrogen system, we could then run it through some sort of turbine or other system. Actually, how do the costs compare? And, people have done this, and as you'd expect, the electricity option is cheaper because it's simpler and so on. But actually, if we think about the context, and really the point here is not about these, it's about the importance of the context in which the vectors are used. What we can see is that actually as the load factor in this example of the electricity demand decreases, the costs for that option actually increase quite a lot, whereas the costs for the hydrogen option, because you've got more buffering in the system, don't increase as much. So here we were looking at really a crossover point if we were actually using both systems to produce electricity. So basically both systems are being used to do the same thing, where we've got a crossover point of about 40% load factor. So if electricity is only being needed 40% of the time, then actually both systems cost about the same. And in this, again, it's really just an example of a context where actually the use of the vectors is important. But in this case, actually, we would expect that to be around about the load factor of some plants going to the future as there's more wind and other electricity sources on the grid. Okay, so we've given quite a lot of kind of different ways in which we've looked at vectors and the importance of vectors and how their impacts vary over time. Really, we're going to move on to Stephen's talk in a moment, which is looking at a very specific kind of aspect of that. But just before we do, are there any sort of questions or things where you'd like more information on this? No? Sounds good. Stephen, over to you then. So I think it's just this.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Steven Doliente. I'm a research associate from the University of Bath. I'm working with Sam and Marcel on Vectors team. So just a bit of context. So I've joined the project around 3 months ago. So working as casual first, then to a full-time position. So I was fortunate to attend last June the Researchers' Day. So I gave the initial work done, and then so today is a bit of just the progress really, and yeah. So we are working with a colleague from Manchester for this project, Muir. So the outline of my presentation is from an introduction to a methodology, the progress so far, and then the next step. So for my introduction, so the petrochemicals industry is one of the highest energy consumption in total, of course. And in terms of primary oil demand, it's next to transport, and in terms of natural gas, it's it's twice more than the transport sector. So in the UK alone, the process emissions for chemical sector is the second highest. And if you look at the nice diagram on I think on your right? So you can see that the almost everything we use has fossil fuels in it because of the plastics, the resins, the solvents, and also fertilizers being used by your farmers. So in between of that is between that is the platform chemicals that you produce from your fossil fuels. So the chemical sector is a quite unique sector because the feedstock that you use is being used as energy to drive it. At the same time, it's being used to produce stuff. And as mentioned earlier by Sarah, like you cannot really decarbonize it because essentially you need the carbon to create your petrochemicals. But there are alternatives, of course, which includes your water, CO2, and biomass. So relatively, there is low uptake of biomass into the sector. So the main motivation, of course, is because net zero. So across all the industries, we have to decarbonize it. Or in the case of the petrochemicals, fossilize it essentially, and biomass is going to be very important to do this exercise. So in the recent report from UKRI Knowledge Transfer Network, so if you look at the supply chain, and if you want to put biomass there's a bit of a disconnect between your farmers and your chemical manufacturing sectors. So in terms of your chemical manufacturing sectors, they're not quite sure, or the data actually of what chemicals need to be produced. It's not really clear. And in terms of your farmers, essentially they don't really know what to plant. So that's quite the chicken and egg problem between the two. So there is an opportunity to look at it and in a supply chain perspective, from which my background or my the tools that I learned during my PhD is going to be used. So obviously we want a supply chain that will provide you with the optimal pathway from biomass to the petrochemicals. And yes, there are already existing frameworks and which can be used to do this. And obviously this exercise, the key is to inform the stakeholders across the supply chains, because that's what will make the most impact really. So the overarching objective, as I think before I was saying that what's really, I mean, in the June presentation. So what is really the objective? So I guess the objective here is to model UK-based petrochemical supply chains that can help provide evidence for its role in achieving net zero. And so it will answer hopefully, what is the optimal configuration? So optimal configuration means okay, where to put your farms, where to site your chemical conversion plants, and where to deliver this stuff that's being produced. And this is going to be based on minimum cost, which is a very important part. And then the question is, of course, because we want to have a net zero, is it going to have a minimum greenhouse gas emissions? And hopefully it's negative. Or a combination of these two, because usually, when sometimes you want high cost, okay, you tend to get high emissions. And if you want to have low emissions, okay, you have to shell out a bit more money. And obviously we want to run some scenarios or see other configurations, and generate insights and key messages. And from the earlier discussions today, obviously a model will always have an error, and hopefully when we try to do this exercise, we have to keep that in mind. And also, like, in the long term, if we have the results already, it's like to have if there's going to be another showcase in the future, to have a feedback from the industry about the results of this study. So this was the initial scoping, and I can remember Patricia's comment on this one was like, it is ambitious. And indeed, we agree to that. But what's just the general message of this? That actually there are already existing technologies, biochemical and thermochemical technologies that can transform a variety of a biomass feedstock into the platform chemicals. So the one on the rightmost, the orange colored one, are your platform chemicals, from hydrogen to methanol to ethylene. I mean the olefins, the benzene, toluene, and xylene. So for our project, we will just focus on one area. I will talk about that later. And obviously, we thought of of course, the whole UK for the, but again, our scope will be narrowed down. So, like for any model, or for any, what's the problem statement for this? So this is a typical way of representing a supply chain problem. So you're given with a potential available land in the UK. You know the yields, well, theoretically and also actual, and then you know the demand data for the platform chemicals, and then you have the processing technologies. Specifically, what data you need for that is, of course, the techno-economics, the size, the capacities, etc. And you have the transporting technologies and infrastructure. So you should also know the cost of transporting, and what's the available infrastructure. Can you transport from one point to another by truck, by train, etc. And you want to determine the two things from a supply chain. Of course, the design of the supply chain. So it's basically where to locate your plantations, where to build your technologies, and you want to know the structure of your transporting network, whether it's a centralized one, a decentralized one, etc. And you want to know the operation, of course. So how much of the biomass you need to produce, how much petrochemicals is going to be produced also, and also the logistical operations, basically what transport mode, etc. Which is in order to, of course, minimize the cost and at the same time minimize climate impact. And this is subject to to meeting the demands or more of the demands, the potentially available lands, and the availability and the limits basically of your technologies. So what are the model elements? So in the model, we can represent time. So it can be granulated. So we initially thought of until 2050 planning, so that's 28 years. And then you go down to 52 weeks, to 7 days, to 24 hours. But assuming that there's no variability, we can assume that it's almost constant throughout the year. So we won't really take into account the season. For the spatial representation, I think it's really good to have a more granulated spatial representation because you're dealing with biomass, which is its distribution through space is important. So we thought of the mainland UK and with 96 zones in it. And so the model elements, you have the resource technologies representation. So the upper diagram is assuming you have one zone or a county that are the potential pathways. So we narrowed it down to the pathway from biomass to gasification that we produce syngas, and then our petrochemicals will be just hydrogen, methanol, and olefin. So that's what we thought would be the focus for. Of course, we wanted to do BTX, but the data is so hard to get. Well, I can show you the data later. And then the transportation of resources between zones. So because if it's just going to be the mainland, then it would just be limited to transport by truck. So that's just showing you from zone Z to zone prime how, we were thinking, okay, what if we transport both the feedstock and the petrochemicals? So the mathematical model for this, so I will not be inventing new mathematics, but I'm building upon the mathematics from the value web model, which its history can be traced back to the BVCM, and its framework or its research technology structure is from also that one. So it's a generic and flexible spatio-temporal multi-vector, multi-objective optimization, mixed integer linear programming. So it's a really mouthful, but I think the most important word there is vector, I think. And I think I really don't want to, go down to the details of the maths, but it's just basically showing a multi-objective function. Within the parenthesis is the various impacts. So we take into account the impacts of cultivation, the impacts of production, the impacts of transport, and then the impacts of utilization of the raw materials. And of course, it's going to be subtracted with the earnings you create from this. So it's a multi-objective, so you can set it to from either you want to focus on minimum cost or minimum greenhouse gas emissions. So the mathematical model also has representations for the various constraints that you have to take into account. So for example, so the main driving equation would there be the resource balance. So that's within a zone, within a time. And then you have demand satisfaction, the amount of resources that you can utilize, the amount of biomass that you can produce, the land footprint, the limits of your technology. So it's all accounted in this mathematical formulation. And yeah, so far, how I wish I was able to run the model yet, but we're in the input data collection. So I think what we thought for meantime to show you the progress of what we have gathered so far with the input data and give you an idea of how will the model will look like given the current data that we have. So in terms, we thought of miscanthus, willow, and municipal solid waste. But if you look into the lignocellulosics, so you can see from as much as possible the data we collected was for the UK because we wanted this supply chain to be as realistic as possible, but of course there will be errors. And obviously we found that the yield is within the what's really in mentioned earlier this morning, and in terms of cost also, and it's quite in agreement the literature data. However, in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, there's a bit of variation. I think I should be careful with the word variability and variation, but I think the proper word is variation. So I guess this is because of the conflicting, or maybe the way researchers did their research or measurements, I mean. And then I wanted to show that because in the model we try to as much as account for the sequestration of the lignocellulosic. So we can see here that I think in terms, miscanthus seems to be a good candidate to do this kind of supply chain in terms of sequestration, if that's really the goal. And then how about for the trends of the conversion technologies? So it seems that there is a good agreement in terms of production of syngas, which is the starting point to produce your petrochemicals. And in terms of, there's a good agreement in the conversion. However, there is a bit of variation again in the capital when building the gasification plants. And I guess this comes again to the assumptions, the conditions of the various techno-economic assessments done actually. And then on the other side is how about the conversion from syngas to the platform chemicals. And except for methanol synthesis, all the other guys are in consistency with their conversion. And again, there is again variation when it comes to the capital impact of building the technologies. It seems here, although it's quite interesting, we can see that from syngas, it looks like methanol is a better pathway in terms of its efficiency. However, I'm a bit not sure with that because of the variation of the the data that we got. from that one. Although I predict in the, us doing modeling about supply chains, usually the model would recommend the technology with a very good efficiency most of the time. Except, of course, there will be other constraints on that one. For the trends for transport technology, it's so hard to get data points, and I've just wanted to show you the that when you try to model transport, you have to think about the fixed cost, the outright cost that your transport will cost you, and then the dependent cost or the variable cost that's through the as it travels from one point to another. And so I've considered both the petrochemicals and the feedstocks, and obviously hydrogen by truck is very expensive if you're gonna go down that route. So I'm not sure if I'm gonna include that in the model per se. And then trends for transportation technologies in terms of the emissions for your transport, and I've considered like two types: in a rigid truck and an articulated truck. So the rigid one is for your feedstocks, and your articulated one will be for your tankers, assuming that it will be used for transporting your petrochemicals. Okay. And so the next steps is to complete the input data collection and reprocessing, because they need to be in a format before you put into the model. And we would like to look at the comparison between without carbon capture and storage, and with carbon capture. And then we analyze and generate insights. And I hope in the next round, I hope there'll be, I'm not sure, we get to show you the results. So thank you very much. So these are the references, and thank you very much for your attention.